Sometimes the most incredible discoveries appear where we least expect them. One man stumbled upon something that changed his life forever. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Calvin Harper had always been a man of persistence. Even in his 60s, with hair gone gray at the temples and his body worn by the weight of years, there was a stubborn strength in the way he carried himself. His frame was still broad from his years in the army, his back still straight even when his joints protested. Discipline had never left him, not in the decades since he first learned to march, endure, and obey. But now, with the battles long behind him, he lived quietly at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains, where the silence of pine forests and the whisper of wind through the ridges had become his only companions. The shack he called home leaned against time like an old soldier refusing to fall, its boards weathered and faded, its porch sagging with age. He had patched the roof himself after storms, mended the railings, and built a small shed out back where he kept his tools. Life was stripped to its bones here. Firewood stacked against the wall, a single-room kitchen with shelves of canned goods, and a bed that creaked when he lay down at night. He needed little more. Solitude was no enemy to him. It was an old friend, one that reminded him each morning that he had survived when so many others hadn't. What gave his days shape now was not work in the fields or the labor of a farm, but his passion for history buried in the earth. Calvin had taken up metal detecting in his later years, a hobby that became an obsession. There was something about the quiet hum of the device, the way the coil swept low over the ground, that stirred his blood. Each sharp beep was a pulse, a call from the past waiting to be uncovered. Most days he found nothing more than rusted nails, spent bullets, or corroded coins dropped by hunters decades ago. But to him, even the smallest relic mattered. Each one was a fragment of stories left untold. He knew these mountains carried secrets. Settlers had crossed here long before railroads or paved roads, soldiers had marched through during the Civil War, and countless lives had been lived, forgotten, and swallowed by the soil. Sometimes, kneeling in the dirt with a tarnished coin in his hand, he imagined the person who had dropped it. Maybe a soldier, maybe a farmer, maybe a child who never grew up. Those thoughts gave weight to the relics, turning them into more than scraps of metal. They were memory, history, and heritage. Calvin often traced this passion back to the army days, to the long nights overseas when he'd stare at the stars and wonder how many men before him had done the same. He had buried comrades, carried them home in flag-draped coffins, and lived with ghosts ever since. Digging into the ground with his shovel now was different, but it gave him the same feeling, that he was standing watch, that he was protecting something larger than himself. The locals in town thought of him as the old man with the detector. Some nodded politely when they saw him. Others chuckled at the sight of him wandering through fields with headphones on, sweeping his coil back and forth. He didn't mind. Their opinions carried no weight compared to the satisfaction of pulling something forgotten out of the soil. Besides, he preferred being underestimated. That day had begun like many others. The storm had passed the night before, rattling his windows and bending the trees until they groaned. The earth still smelled of rain when Calvin strapped on his boots, slung his detector over his shoulder, and headed into the hills. He always went alone. The woods felt different in solitude, more alive, as though the birds, the rustle of branches, and the crunch of soil underfoot all spoke only to him. The mountains stretched upward like dark shoulders against the sky. Pines crowded close along the trails, and fog clung stubbornly to the ridges where lightning had danced the night before. Calvin chose a path he hadn't walked in months, one that wound along the base of a rocky slope and twisted toward higher ground. The air was sharp, filled with the damp tang of moss and stone. As he walked, his detector clicked softly, the coil sweeping close to the ground. Each faint chirp made his pulse quicken, though most signals proved worthless. A fragment of wire, a rusted bottle cap, the remnants of old machinery. But Calvin's patience was endless. He had been trained to wait, to endure, to search inch by inch until the mission was complete. Mid-morning light filtered weakly through the trees when he paused at a clearing, brushing rain from his jacket sleeve. The ground here was uneven, littered with fallen branches and scarred by erosion. He had heard old stories about this part of the range, tales of cabins abandoned during the war, of caravans that never reached their destinations. Legends didn't interest him much, but he knew that where people had been, something always remained. Kneeling, he pushed the detector's coil slowly across the damp earth. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then a tone pierced his headphones, sharp and insistent. He froze, sweeping the coil again to confirm. The sound was stronger this time, deep and solid, unlike the faint signals of surface trash. His chest tightened with a familiar thrill. Something was buried here, and not shallow. He planted the detector upright and reached for his shovel. The soil was heavy with water, clinging to the blade as he dug. At first, he expected to see the usual: rust, scraps of iron. But the hole grew deeper, and the sound grew louder with every layer of earth removed. His breath quickened, sweat running down his brow despite the cool air. Something was down there, something large. When his shovel struck metal, the vibration ran up his arm. The sound was not the thin clang of a nail or can. This was heavier, denser. He crouched lower, using his hands to pull away clumps of earth until the shape began to emerge. At first, it looked like the corner of a chest, but as he cleared more, doubt crept in. The edges were too smooth, too symmetrical. His heart thudded as the soil gave way to reveal the outline of a massive object. It was longer than a man, curved slightly at the edges. The surface, though corroded, gleamed dark beneath the dirt. Calvin sat back on his heels, staring, his breath fogging in the cool mountain air. He knew what he was looking at, though his mind resisted the thought. This wasn't a box. It wasn't machinery. It was a coffin. Not a wooden one, not the kind lowered into graves with prayers and soil. This was forged of iron or some alloy blackened by time, streaked green from corrosion. Intricate designs were carved faintly into its surface, though centuries of rain and stone had worn them nearly invisible. Along the center of the lid, beneath the grime, he thought he saw letters. Initials, perhaps, etched in an old-fashioned hand. He brushed at them with trembling fingers, but the dirt clung stubbornly. A shiver ran through him despite the heat rising in his chest. Why here? Why in the mountains, far from any cemetery, would a coffin be buried, sealed in metal, as though meant to withstand eternity? His instinct, sharpened from years of service, warned him that some things found in the earth carried more than stories. They carried curses, dangers, or truths men had sought to bury forever. And yet, Calvin felt the pull stronger than any fear. He had found relics before, but nothing like this. This was not a coin or a relic of war. This was a secret carved into the bones of the mountains themselves, waiting for him to uncover it. He tightened his grip on the shovel, breath steadying. He would not leave it here. The mountains had always given Calvin Harper a sense of stability. He had walked their trails for years, studied their ridges, and learned their moods like a man learns the temper of an old comrade. Yet, as he stood over the half-uncovered shape lodged in the earth, stability was the last thing he felt. His detector still leaned against a nearby boulder, its coil damp with rain, but its job was finished. What it had revealed defied every expectation he had carried into these woods. The coffin, if that was truly what it was, rested stubbornly in the slope, wedged deep against stone as though the mountain itself had tried to hold it hidden. Calvin's first instinct was to cover it again, to pretend he had never found it. But the longer he stared, the less able he was to look away. The metal surface gleamed dark through the mud, and the faint engravings along its length seemed to whisper a story that demanded to be told. He pressed his gloved hands against the soil, widening the hole carefully. Earth crumbled away in damp clumps, sliding down the incline. Each motion revealed more of the coffin's smooth edges, too perfect to be the work of chance. His breath came slow, steady, though his heartbeat thudded in his ears. At last, enough of the surface was cleared for him to study it closely. The engravings were faint, but undeniable. Patterns of lines and curves etched with precision long ago. They weren't decorative in the way of casual carvings. They carried intention. Calvin leaned closer, his calloused fingers brushing dirt away until a patch of letters emerged. 3 initials. H.C. Duwam. The script was old-fashioned, curling elegantly despite the corrosion. H.C.W., he muttered aloud, testing the weight of the letters. He didn't know the name, but the style struck him as something from another century. Whoever had been sealed inside this coffin had not been an ordinary man. He sat back on his heels, staring at the shape, trying to reason it through. A coffin buried deep in the Appalachian soil, built of heavy metal instead of wood, etched with initials and strange patterns. Why here, in the wilderness, far from marked graves? Had someone carried it up these ridges and lowered it here in secret? And if so, what was so important about the body that it required iron walls and bolts thick as a man's thumb? The questions stirred him more than fear. He felt the same gnawing pull he had once known in the service, the sense that beneath the surface of things lay something greater than appearances. It wasn't recklessness, it was duty, the instinct to face the unknown rather than walk away from it. He knew he couldn't leave the coffin embedded in the slope. Rain and time had already begun the slow work of erosion. One day it might slide free on its own, tumbling into the valley below, and whatever it contained would be lost or desecrated. No, if this had come to him, he was meant to carry it forward. But moving it would not be easy. He circled the object, testing its edges, and found it wedged tight against jagged stone. The mountain had clasped it like a fist. Grunting, he shoved his shoulder against one side, but the coffin didn't budge. Its weight was immense, far beyond what one man could lift unaided. Calvin retreated, breathing hard, and studied the slope above. Loose rocks littered the incline, and damp earth glistened where the storm had washed away soil. He had tools in his pack: rope, a compact hand winch, and an old entrenching spade he always carried. With enough leverage, he could pry the coffin loose, then drag it inch by inch down toward flatter ground. It would take hours, maybe days, but patience was the one resource he had in abundance. He worked methodically, driving the spade into the soil to widen the pit around the coffin. Each strike of the blade sent shudders through his tired arms. He tied rope around the narrow end of the metal shape, securing it to a pine trunk farther upslope. Sweat ran down his brow, mixing with the damp earth, but he pressed on. Slowly, he chipped away the stone's grip. The effort became a battle of will. Muscles burned as he strained against the rope, bracing his boots against slick rock. The coffin groaned faintly, metal scraping against stone, and for the first time it shifted. The sound was deep, echoing, like a voice stirring after a long sleep. Calvin froze, breath sharp in his throat, before reminding himself it was nothing more than friction. He pulled harder. Bit by bit, the coffin loosened, Sliding with grudging resistance toward freedom, at last it tore free from the slope, dropping with a heavy thud onto the ground below. The impact sent vibrations through the earth beneath Calvin's boots. He stood over it, chest heaving, arms trembling from exhaustion. The coffin lay before him now, its full length visible for the first time. It was longer than his own body by nearly a foot, yet startlingly narrow at the shoulders and feet. The surface was corroded but intact, barnacle-like growths of mineral clinging to its sides. The engraving stretched across its lid, forming floral patterns interwoven with the initials at the center. Time had gnawed at them, but not enough to erase their deliberate design. Calvin crouched again, his breath steadying. He pressed his hand flat against the lid. The metal was cold, even in the warmth of the morning sun, as though it held the chill of the grave within it. He traced the letters once more, HCW, and wondered who the man or woman beneath had been. A soldier? A leader? Someone whose death had demanded secrecy so absolute that they were entombed in iron and hidden in the mountains? A wave of unease washed through him. His instincts whispered that some things discovered were best left buried. Yet another voice inside him, stronger, urged him onward. He hadn't stumbled upon this by accident. The storm, the path he had chosen, the detector's insistent call, it felt as though the mountain itself had delivered him here. He tied the rope again, this time to drag the coffin across the ground. The task was grueling. Inch by inch, the heavy shape scraped over rocks and dirt, gouging a trail behind it. His back screamed with every pull, his legs shaking from strain. But he didn't stop until the coffin rested on flatter ground, where he could study it more closely. There, in the thin sunlight that pierced through the trees, the details stood clearer. Along the edges of the lid, bolts protruded like iron teeth, their heads fused with rust. They sealed the coffin tight, as if to forbid the intrusion of curious hands. Calvin knew at once that it wouldn't open easily. He would need his tools, his grinder, and long hours of labor. He stood over it for a long moment, chest heaving, sweat cooling on his skin. The coffin looked impossibly old, yet impossibly whole, as though time itself had failed to break its seal. And Calvin Harper, alone in the mountains, knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would open it. He returned at first light with his pack heavier than usual. Crowbar, hammer, chisels wrapped in canvas, extra rope, a coil of rags, the compact grinder he kept for stubborn metal, and a small bottle of oil. The storm smell had gone from the woods, replaced by the clean scent of pine and damp rock. The coffin lay where he had dragged it, a dark oblong against the pale litter of leaves and shale, as immovable and self-possessed as a boulder. For a long moment, he simply stood and looked at it, measuring himself against the task. Then he set to work. The bolts were the first problem. They ringed the lid in intervals, iron heads swollen with rust, fused to their seats by time and pressure. He knelt and tried the crowbar on the seam. The tool slipped with a grating squeal. No use. He dabbed a little oil on the nearest bolt, working it into the crust with the tip of a rag, then rapped the head lightly with the hammer to wake the threads. The sound thudded into the earth, dull and reluctant. He tested again and felt nothing but refusal. He accepted what the work would require the way a soldier accepts a long march, without complaint. He tightened his gloves and brought the grinder to life. Its motor whined, startling a jay from a nearby branch. Sparks leapt and vanished in the damp air as he kissed the wheel to the first bolt, shaving away the rust. The smell of scorched iron mixed with the resin of pine. He moved patiently, never forcing, never lingering long enough to heat the metal through. When he judged the head clean enough, he tapped again with the hammer, working the crowbar in at a different angle. The bolt shifted by the width of a hair. He smiled without showing his teeth. Progress. Hours dissolved into a rhythm. Grind, tap, pry, rest the shoulders, then begin again. When his knees ached, he stood. When his back burned, he knelt. When his hands cramped, he flexed them open and closed until feeling returned. He drank water in short, efficient swallows. He spoke aloud only once, when the second bolt surrendered with a sharp metallic pop that echoed off the trees. "That's it," he murmured. "Come on, then." By noon, he had freed 4. He marked each with a scratch so he wouldn't waste time retesting them and turned the coffin slowly on the ground to keep the working edge in shade. The engravings along the lid, delicate lines looping into floral knots, seemed to wake a little as the grime fell away in places, as if the design were remembering itself. At the center, the initials he had uncovered the day before waited like a riddle. HCW. He did not try to answer them. The metal would give him what it would in the order it chose. When the sun slid down behind the ridge and the light thinned, he packed his tools and covered the coffin with his tarp, weighting the corners with stones. He came back the next morning and the next, each day carrying the same steady patience, each day leaving with another increment of victory. The work scarred his gloves and nicked the grinder's wheel. It freckled his sleeves with rust and grit. It worked soreness into his joints deep as old weather. He welcomed the fatigue because it told him the mountain was letting go. On the third day, with sweat cooling on his neck despite the chill, he pried the penultimate bolt clean and paused to listen. The woods had grown quiet. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. He brushed the seam with his fingers, testing for give. The lid still clung stubbornly to the base. One more. The last bolt was the worst. It sat low on the coffin's flank where water had pooled over the years, welding iron to iron. The grinder spat a brighter fan of sparks there and died twice under the strain, until he coaxed it back with patience and the lightest touch he could manage. He took breaks not to rest but to think, studying the angle, trying new leverage points, feeling for that subtle change when force becomes persuasion. At last, after an hour that felt longer, the sound came. Not a pop, but a long groan of old metal unseating. He rocked back on his heels, breathing hard, 7 bolts loose. Nothing now but the seal of time. He slid the crowbar under the lid and felt along the seam. In places the joint was as tight as pressed coins, in others the rust had swollen into flaky scabs. He chose a corner where his work had the cleanest purchase and leaned his weight slowly, carefully, letting the lid know he was there. The coffin answered with a low creak that tightened the skin at the back of his neck. He shifted to a second point, then a third, working around the perimeter. The groans grew, metal complaining in long, sad vowels. The lid moved scarcely at all at first. Then it lifted the width of a fingernail. Cold air slipped through the crack and touched his face with a surprising dryness, as though it had come from a cellar sealed before his grandparents were born. He paused, letting the strangeness settle. The instinct to stop, a simple human recoil from intruding on the dead, brushed him and passed. He had not come this far to abandon the truth inch from his hands. He wedged the crowbar deeper and lifted again. The seam opened another fraction. Dust whispered out. He shifted, lifted, shifted, lifted, the sweat coming fresh despite the cool. At last, the lid tilted enough to catch itself. He slid both hands under the edge, braced his boots, and pushed. The coffin answered with one long scrape as the lid moved aside and settled against the ground. He did not look in immediately. He let his breathing even out, heard the wheeze of the grinder cooling, the drip of water from leaves high overhead. Then he leaned forward. He had prepared himself, he thought, for the obvious. Bones. Cloth collapsed into powder, the dismal artifacts of mortality. What lay before him stole the air from his mouth just the same. No body. The interior was a chamber of careful order. Bundles wrapped in oilcloth nested end to end, their edges crisp despite their age. Small chests, no larger than a lunch pail, had been wedged so tightly that they could not rattle even in rough transit. A narrow tray ran the length of one side, filled with rolled papers bound by faded ribbon, and a few objects wrapped in layers of fabric so thin they looked like shadows. Everything had been arranged with an intent that felt almost ceremonial, more vault than tomb. He reached in as a man might reach into a church, deliberately, with the awareness that his hands were a part of a moment larger than themselves. The first bundle he lifted left a clean rectangle of dust beneath it. The oilcloth crackled under his fingers and flaked where it had been folded. He worried the knot free and peeled back the layers. Gold found the light. Not a fantasy mound, not the bright chaos of storybook treasure. Stacks, neat and patient and undeniable. 2 columns of coins lay side by side, their edges chewed by time, faces dull under a film of age. He did not need a date to know they were old. He brushed one with his thumb, and the metal answered with a glow that lived under the grime. Beneath the coins waited a thin bar stamped with a mark he could not yet read, and several irregular nuggets the color of warm straw. He closed the bundle with care and set it aside on a clean patch of tarp. The second package held no metal at all. Strings of pearls coiled like sleeping snakes. A brooch studded with stones whose color still burned through dust. A pair of delicate earrings shaped like leaves. He stared longer at those than at the gold. They were the work of hands, not minds. Proof that people had touched these things, chosen them, worn them, and then consented to see them hidden. The first small chest fought him at the latch until he coaxed it with the tip of a knife. Its lid lifted with a sigh. Inside lay more coins, these thinner, stamped with profiles and wreaths, and an alphabet different from the letters he used every day. He did not count. He looked, learned the weight of the sight, closed the lid, and slid the chest aside. The tray along the coffin wall drew him next. The ribbons binding the papers had bled their color into the edges, staining them ruddy. He lifted one roll, tested the brittleness of the sheet beneath with the gentlest touch. He could not yet risk unrolling anything here in the open air, not when the least crack might break the fibers. He returned the paper to its place and moved on. At the far end of the tray, under a square of cloth more carefully folded than the rest, he found a smaller object. He knew what it was before he opened it, because time teaches certain shapes to the hand. A locket, no bigger than a walnut, its hinge furred with corrosion. He held it in his palm a moment, feeling how naturally it settled there, as if it had waited to return to a human grip. Then he worked the blade of his knife into the seam and worried it gently until the case parted. Inside, behind a film that had once been glass and was now a clouded membrane, a woman's portrait looked back at him. The image was tiny, precise, and tired by age, but the face was clear enough to feel real. Eyes that watched without reproach, a mouth held firm as if accustomed to doing so. Her hair had been arranged in a style he had seen only in old photographs. She wore something dark at her throat, a ribbon perhaps, or a collar closed by a small pin. The detail mattered less than the impression, the undeniable humanity sealed away with objects as though they were all of a piece. He closed the locket and turned it in his fingers. On the back, where thumb had polished a faint oval in the tarnish, an inscription had been engraved in small, careful letters. The corrosion had taken bites out of the strokes, but the meaning survived. A name's initials, then a short line, then a second set of letters. He traced the first 2 with his thumb, sounding them in his head. He did not speak. He felt the letters as if they had texture. There are moments when the past stops being a fog that other people walk in and becomes weather on your own skin. This was such a moment. The coincidence was too much like a design, and yet he did not let his mind gallop into certainty. He set the locket down with the same care he would have used to set down a teacup that belonged to a friend. He stood and stretched, letting the ache in his back roll through him, then looked again into the coffin, taking in the whole. The bundles, the chests, the tray with its sleeping papers, the locket, and the empty space where a body should have lain. The intent was plain now. This was not burial. This was concealment with ceremony. Whoever had packed this vault had meant it to outlast weather, fire, looters, and time. They had succeeded, until patience and a coil of copper wire in an old man's hand found them. He wiped his palms on his trousers and began the practical work of sorting. He rewrapped each bundle he had opened, tying knots he could undo without tools. He slid a folded blanket under the lid to keep grit from scarring the engravings. He laid his canvas on the ground and arranged what he had removed in the order he had found it so the story of placement would not be lost. He told himself the same thing he had told himself in other duties long ago: respect is a method as much as a feeling. When the sun reached the ridge and grew thin again, he covered the coffin and the array beside it, weighted the edges of the tarp, and sat on a fallen log to breathe. His hands were gray to the wrists, his shirt smelled of iron and earth, his mouth tasted faintly of metal. He closed his eyes and saw the locket's initials printed against the dark. E.H. The line below them would keep. The papers would keep. All of it would hold until he could handle it where there was table space, where the air could be controlled, where time could be treated as gently as it deserved. He rose and checked every tie, every stone on the tarp, every tool in his pack. The woods had found their noise again. Chips, drips, distant wing beats, yet the clearing felt changed, as if the mountain were aware of the open lid and the open secret. He touched the coffin once with the back of his fingers, almost a salute. Then he shouldered his pack and started down the slope with the measured tread of a man who knows he will return at first light to face the meaning of what he has found. He did not need to say it aloud to feel it settle in him. This was a vault, not a grave. And whatever story had demanded this disguise had at last sent up its signal through the earth for him to find. Calvin Harper had not slept well since the moment the coffin first opened. Even when his body lay heavy in bed, his mind refused to rest. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the bundles, the coins, the gleam of gold buried in oilcloth, and most of all, the locket with its initials. The discovery was too heavy to leave behind on the mountain slope. It clung to him like damp air, following him from the shed to his kitchen and back to his bed. The fourth morning after the opening, he sat at his kitchen table staring at the locket under the weak light of a single lamp. The engraved initials stared back at him. He knew those letters. He had heard them before, not from books, but from the quiet evenings of his childhood, when his grandfather told stories by the fire. They had spoken of a man named Elijah Harper, a free man of color who lived along the coast during the Civil War. Some said he had been a sailor. Others whispered that he smuggled messages and helped move people through dangerous territory. Most in the family thought those tales were only prideful inventions, stories meant to make poor lives feel rich. But now Calvin was holding proof. The locket, the letters, the coffin filled with valuables, it all traced back to something far larger than treasure. It pointed to a man who had lived, fought, and hidden something so carefully that it remained sealed for more than a century. Elijah Harper was no myth. He was flesh and blood, bound to Calvin's family by bloodlines that now pulsed in his own veins. Calvin returned to the mountain the same day, carrying notebooks, gloves, and a small lantern. He wanted to study without disturbing more than necessary. The coffin waited where he had left it, covered in his tarp, still heavy with silence. He pulled the cover back and looked once more into its hollow. Every item inside seemed deliberate, arranged as though whoever had sealed it had intended for someone to find and understand. He unwrapped a different chest this time. The lid creaked but opened with coaxing. Inside lay letters and documents, yellowed but legible. The ink curled across the page in a script that belonged to another century. He squinted, holding them closer to the lantern's glow, and read words that made his pulse quicken. Safe passage secured. Cargo concealed. Funds transported. One signature appeared again and again. E. Harper. His breath caught. It was more than a name. It was a role. Elijah Harper had not been a passenger or a servant. He had been entrusted with something monumental. Confederate gold, valuables, documents meant to strengthen a cause that fought to preserve slavery. But Elijah had not delivered them. Instead, he had hidden them away, sealing them where no hand could reach. Calvin felt pride welling up like heat. His ancestor had made a choice, an act of defiance against the Confederacy, against an entire system of cruelty. Elijah had stolen from those who would have used that wealth to prolong suffering. In hiding it, he had stolen history itself. But pride was only part of what Calvin felt. Alongside it came unease. The discovery was no longer just relics. It was testimony, evidence of rebellion in its own right. If this story were told, it would not remain small. Historians, collectors, even treasure hunters would descend upon these mountains. The thought of outsiders trampling the woods, prying into his life, gnawed at him. Back in his cabin that evening, he spread the papers across his table, careful to keep them in order. His eyes traced the ink, deciphering mentions of ships, routes, and coded notes about weather. Each scrap seemed to confirm Elijah's role. Not a thief, but a guardian. Someone who had risked everything to ensure that the Confederacy's riches never reached their destination. And then there was the locket. Calvin opened it again, studying the woman's portrait inside. Her face was calm, strong, eyes steady even through the faded image. Beneath it, the inscription, "To E.H., my steadfast hand in the storm." The words pressed into him with a weight heavier than gold. This was no random sailor. This was a man with love, with family, with ties that had stretched across time to reach Calvin now. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? To lock it away would dishonor the sacrifice. To tell, it might unleash chaos he could not control. As the lantern flickered low, he whispered aloud, as though Elijah himself might be listening. "You didn't hide this for me to bury it again. You wanted it remembered." The silence that followed was deep, filled only with the creak of the cabin's timbers and the faint whisper of the wind outside. Calvin knew then that his life had changed. He could no longer be just an old man wandering the woods with a detector. He had inherited a story, a legacy, and the choice of how to carry it forward. He closed the locket gently, setting it beside the stack of papers, and blew out the lantern. Darkness filled the room, but his thoughts burned bright. Tomorrow, he would return again. Tomorrow, he would decide whether to keep this secret in the quiet of the mountains or to share it with the world. The days that followed pressed on Calvin like the weight of an invisible hand. The mountain no longer felt silent. It watched. Every rustle of branches, every crunch of gravel underfoot set his instincts on edge. He had lived most of his life surrounded by the quiet of nature, but now the quiet had turned suspicious, as though the forest itself knew what he had uncovered. It began with glances. At the general store one morning, Calvin caught two men whispering near the door, their eyes lingering too long when he passed by with rope and kerosene. He recognized one of them, Jace Milner, a wiry local who had a reputation for trouble. The smile Jace gave him wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile a wolf offers before it closes in. The next day, a pickup rolled slow along the gravel road near Calvin's shack, the driver staring openly at his shed before pulling away. The following evening, another truck slowed in the same place, its headlights cutting through the trees before disappearing into the dark. Coincidence didn't exist in places like this. Word had leaked. Someone had seen him dragging the coffin, or heard him asking about old Confederate cargo at the library. By the fourth night, the threat became real. Calvin woke to the crunch of gravel outside his window. His heart slammed against his chest, pulling him upright in bed. The clock on the wall read just past midnight. He pulled on his boots and jacket in silence, his old army instincts sharpening each movement. The sound came again. Footsteps near the shed. A metallic rattle followed, the unmistakable scrape of someone fumbling with a lock. He reached into the drawer by his bed and pulled out the utility knife he kept from his service days. With his other hand, he grabbed the heavy flashlight. Moving like a shadow, he crossed the creaking floorboards and slipped outside into the cool night air. The moon hung low, thin clouds dragging across it. His property stretched before him in shades of gray, the trees shifting in the faint wind. Near the shed, three figures crouched in the dark, their flashlights darting like fireflies against the lock. Jace was among them, his sharp voice whispering curses as the metal refused to give. Calvin circled wide through the trees, moving silently, his boots careful on the damp ground. Years of discipline returned as if no time had passed. He came up behind them, close enough to see the crowbar in one man's hand and the nervous glance of another toward the house. "Step away," Calvin said. His voice was low but carried authority, the kind of tone that cut through chaos in places far harsher than these woods. The men froze. Jace turned slowly, his face caught in the beam of Calvin's flashlight. For a moment, his confidence faltered. "What the hell are you doing, old man?" Jace spat, trying to recover his bravado. "You know what you're doing," Calvin replied evenly, knife held low but visible, flashlight steady. "And you know whose land you're standing on." The second man shifted uneasily, muttering that this wasn't worth it. The third hung back, crowbar still in hand but grip loosening. Jace sneered, puffing himself up as if to reclaim control. "You found something up there," he said. "Don't play dumb. A man doesn't haul a chunk of metal out of the ground and keep it locked away for nothing. We figure whatever's in there is worth more than your quiet little life." Calvin took a step closer, his eyes hard. "You don't know what's in there. You don't know what it means. And you won't find out tonight." The knife gleamed faintly in the beam as he angled it down. Not a threat, but a promise. The air between them tightened. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the wind through the pines. Then the second man muttered again, backing away. The third followed, lowering his crowbar as he retreated to the truck. Jace lingered, jaw tight, but Calvin didn't flinch. Another step forward was all it took. Something in Calvin's eyes, steel forged from war, solitude, and discipline, made Jace break. With a curse, he shoved past the others and climbed into the truck. The engine roared, gravel spat under tires, and the tail lights vanished into the dark. Calvin exhaled slowly, lowering his flashlight. His pulse still thundered, but his voice had stayed steady, his body sure. He checked the shed, running his fingers across the lock. It held, though the marks of the crowbar were fresh and raw. Standing alone in the moonlight, he understood the truth. Secrecy was no longer enough. Word had spread too far, and greed would keep coming. He could not bury the coffin again and pretend it had never been found. The story inside it was too powerful, the temptation too great. He returned to the house and sat at the kitchen table, the locket resting in his hand. The portrait inside seemed to watch him, calm and unyielding. He thought of Elijah Harper, the choice he had made to hide the Confederacy's wealth, to deny it to men who would chain others. Elijah hadn't buried it just for survival. He had buried it for legacy, for principle. And now Calvin had to decide. He could keep the secret and risk his life guarding it, or he could bring it into the light, knowing it would stir up attention far beyond these mountains. Either way, the days of solitude were over. As dawn crept over the ridge, Calvin stood from the table and set the locket down with a quiet resolve. The time for silence had passed. The world would know what he had found. The decision weighed on him all through the morning. Calvin Harper had lived much of his life by instinct, by the quiet pull of duty that never truly left him after the army. He knew what needed to be done, even before he poured his first cup of coffee. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the grooves of the locket one last time, then set it into his pocket. The past had chosen him as its messenger, and he would not betray it. By midday he was driving into town, the coffin still hidden under tarp and rope in his shed. The pickup rattled along the narrow road, every pothole jolting his bones, but his mind was steady. He had called Hank Wallace, an old friend and retired Coast Guard officer who still held the respect of the sheriff's office. Hank had promised to come with a historian from the state university, a man who specialized in Civil War records. Calvin had told them little over the phone, just that he had found something of historical importance and it needed to be properly secured. When he returned to his cabin later that afternoon, Hank's dusty SUV was already waiting by the porch. Hank stood tall despite his own gray years, arms folded across his chest, his expression serious but familiar. Beside him was a thin man with glasses, his eyes sharp and restless with curiosity. "Cal," Hank said, shaking his hand firmly, "you sounded like you had the devil on your tail. Let's see what you've got." Calvin led them to the shed. The lock creaked as he turned the key, and the smell of rust and earth spilled out. He pulled back the tarp, revealing the coffin's dark, massive form. The historian let out a breathless whistle, his glasses catching the fading light. "My God," the man murmured, "this isn't a coffin, it's a vault." Together they lifted the lid. Calvin's chest tightened as the light revealed the treasures once more. The bundles of coins, the pearls coiled like snakes, the documents tied with ribbon, and the locket resting at the edge. Hank swore under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "You weren't exaggerating," he said. "Cal, this is beyond anything I've ever seen." The historian crouched low, fingers hovering reverently above the items without touching. "These markings, Confederate era without question. These documents alone could rewrite parts of history. And this seal here," he lifted a folded sheet, eyes widening, "Confederate transport orders. This is evidence of a cargo that never arrived. People have speculated for over a century. You just brought it back to life." Calvin stayed silent, his eyes drawn again to the locket. He said quietly. "Elijah Harper, my ancestor. He's the one who hid it." The historian looked at him sharply. "Then your family just became part of this story forever." Arrangements were made quickly. The State Historical Commission would send a team to transport and preserve the artifacts under guard. Calvin would be listed as the legal discoverer and entitled to a significant finder's share under salvage law. The historian explained the process with measured excitement, already speaking of exhibitions, preservation techniques, and publications. Hank clapped Calvin's shoulder with a mixture of pride and gravity. "You did the right thing, Cal," he said. "This isn't just treasure, it's history, and you've given it a chance to be remembered the way it should be." When the commission arrived weeks later, news traveled faster than Calvin wanted. Trucks came up the gravel road, cameras followed, and curious faces peered into the once quiet woods. But Calvin held steady. He watched as the artifacts were carefully packed into crates, labeled with precise lettering, and carried into the future. His share came soon after, over $2 million, more money than he had ever imagined holding in his lifetime. Yet, Calvin didn't spend it on luxuries. He fixed the sagging roof of his cabin, rebuilt the dock that had weathered decades, and donated much of the rest. A scholarship was founded in Elijah Harper's name for young men and women with nothing but determination. Funds were given to restore an old black cemetery nearby and its stones leaning and broken from neglect. He even sent a portion to a veteran support network, a nod to brothers he had buried long ago. The town's eyes changed too. Where once they had seen a solitary old man with a metal detector, they now greeted him with respect. Children whispered his name. Adults tipped their hats. Even Jace Milner, the troublemaker who had tried to steal from him, avoided his gaze in silence. Calvin didn't pursue him. The past had already judged him enough. Months later, Calvin stood in a newly built exhibit hall, the treasures of the coffin spread across glass cases under warm light. Crowds murmured, scholars lectured, journalists scribbled notes. At the center sat the locket, open to reveal the woman's faded portrait, the inscription displayed clearly beside it, "To Ai, my steadfast hand in the storm." The historian announced Elijah Harper's story, explaining how a free man of color had defied the Confederacy by hiding its wealth, ensuring it could never fuel slavery's final breath. Applause filled the hall, but Calvin heard only the quiet echo of his grandfather's stories, no longer whispers, but truth carved into history. Later, back at his cabin, Calvin sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, staring at the mountains. The woods were silent again, but not with suspicion, with peace. He thought of Elijah, of the decision he had made long ago, and felt pride steady in his chest. The locket rested on the table beside him, returned to his care by the commission as a gesture of respect. He picked it up, held it in his palm, and whispered, "You're remembered now, not just by me, by everyone." The wind moved through the trees softly, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Calvin closed his eyes, breathing deep. His life, once quiet and solitary, had become something larger. The mountains no longer held a secret. They held a legacy. And for the first time in years, Calvin Harper felt not alone, but part of something eternal. Every story reminds us, secrets can be hidden anywhere. Thank you for watching. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with your friends. Drop your thoughts in the comments below.